The 1962 India-China War, sometimes referred to as the Sino-Indian War, was a conflict that took place high in the Himalayas, on one of the most inhospitable battlefields the world has ever seen. For 32 days, Indian and Chinese soldiers fought in freezing temperatures, with limited supplies, and in some cases, without adequate weapons. But this war wasn't just about a border dispute. It was the culmination of years of tensions, miscalculations, and conflicting ambitions. So what led to this war? How did two nations, which had once shared a vision of peaceful coexistence, end up on opposite sides of a bloody battlefield? To understand this, we need to go back to the beginning, to the years leading up to 1962. In 1947, India gained its independence from British rule, and in 1949, China saw the establishment of the People's Republic of China under Mao Zedong. Both nations were in the process of rebuilding themselves after years of colonialism and revolution. Initially, India and China appeared to be allies. They were both members of the Non-Aligned Movement, a group of nations that refused to take sides in the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. In 1954, the two countries signed the Panchsheel Agreement, which outlined 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. It seemed like a new era of friendship was beginning, but beneath the surface, tensions were simmering. The issue at the heart of the conflict was the border, the vast mountainous region that separates India and China, and more specifically, 2 areas, Aksai Chin and Arunachal Pradesh. The root of the 1962 conflict lay in a border dispute that dated back to the 19th century. When the British ruled India, they had drawn borders that China never officially recognized. One of the most contentious areas was Aksai Chin, a remote region high in the Himalayas, which both India and China claimed. For India, Aksai Chin was part of the northern region of Ladakh. For China, it was part of Xinjiang province. To complicate matters further, China had built a road through Aksai Chin that connected Tibet to Xinjiang. India didn't even know about this road until it was completed in the 1950s, and when they found out, it became a major point of contention. Meanwhile, in the eastern sector, India and China disagreed over the boundary of Arunachal Pradesh, a region that India considered part of its territory, but China claimed as South Tibet. These border disputes may seem distant and abstract, but they were about more than just lines on a map. They were tied to the very identity of the two nations, India's territorial integrity and China's sovereignty. And as tensions grew, it became clear that neither side was willing to back down. Throughout the late 1950s, tensions between India and China continued to escalate. In 1959, the Dalai Lama, the spiritual leader of Tibet, fled to India after a failed uprising against Chinese rule in Tibet. India granted him asylum, which angered the Chinese government. They saw India's support for the Dalai Lama as interference in their internal affairs. By the early 1960s, both countries had begun to establish military outposts along the disputed border. These were small, isolated outposts, manned by soldiers who were ill-prepared for the harsh conditions of the Himalayas. Skirmishes began to break out between Indian and Chinese troops, and the situation was becoming increasingly unstable. In 1961, Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru launched what was known as the Forward Policy. The idea was to establish more outposts along the disputed border to assert India's claim. However, this move only increased tensions, and China saw it as an aggressive step. Both sides began preparing for a larger conflict, and by October 1962, the situation had reached a breaking point. On October 20th, 1962, China launched a massive military offensive against Indian positions along the border. The Chinese troops, who were better prepared and familiar with the terrain, quickly overwhelmed the Indian forces. The fighting was intense and brutal, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The war was fought in 2 main sectors, Ladakh in the west and Arunachal Pradesh in the east. In the eastern sector, Chinese forces rapidly advanced, capturing several key positions. In the western sector, Indian troops were forced to retreat in the face of a well-coordinated Chinese assault. The Indian Army, under-equipped and under-trained for mountain warfare, struggled to hold their ground. As the war unfolded, the international community watched closely. Both the United States and the Soviet Union were preoccupied with the Cuban Missile Crisis at the time, so they were unable to intervene in the India-China conflict. However, both nations were concerned about the war's potential to destabilize the region. The U.S. provided India with limited military support, including weapons and supplies, but it was not enough to turn the tide. Just as quickly as it began, the war came to an abrupt end. On November 21, 1962, China declared a unilateral ceasefire and withdrew its forces to pre-war positions. The reasons for China's decision remain a matter of debate. Some believe that China had achieved its objectives and didn't want to prolong the conflict. Others suggest that logistical challenges and international pressure played a role. In the aftermath of the war, China retained control of Aksai Chin, while India maintained control of Arunachal Pradesh. The border dispute was far from resolved, and tensions between the two countries remained high for decades. The war had a lasting impact on India's foreign policy, leading to a closer relationship with the Soviet Union and a significant increase in military spending. For China, the war solidified its control over Tibet and reinforced its position as a regional power. The 1962 war left deep scars on India's national psyche. For a country that had just emerged from colonial rule, the defeat was a humiliating blow. It exposed the weaknesses in India's military and political leadership, and it forced the nation to rethink its defense strategies. In the years that followed, India would embark on a massive military modernization program, determined never to be caught off guard again. For China, the war demonstrated its military prowess and its determination to defend its borders, but it also sowed the seeds of mistrust between India and China, a mistrust that continues to influence relations between the two nations today.